So now that we've acknowledged the land that allows us to be here today, I am looking forward to introducing you to our wonderful panel. We have Kaitlin, Schwan, Khulud, Baig, and Mary Vaccaro. They are part of the research team from the Pan-Canadian Women's Housing and Homelessness Survey. Thank you to the three of you for being here today. And I'm going to hand things over to our panel member, Kaitlin Schwan, to get us started with this discussion. Welcome, Kaitlin.
Hi everyone. So wonderful to have you here. This is something we've been looking forward to for a long time. The survey was just the result of a tremendous amount of work and love and commitment. So just welcome and looking forward to this discussion. Yeah, briefly, I'll just say my name's Kaitlin Schwan. My pronouns are she, her. I am Director of Research at The Shift, which is an organization focused on advancing the right to housing globally. But also have the pleasure of working with my colleagues here at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, and also at the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. So wearing a few hats today. Yeah, I've been working on homelessness for the last decade, and just tremendously excited to share our findings with you. And Mary, I'll pass it to you.
Hi there, my name is Mary. My pronouns are she, her. I am a PhD student at the School of Social Work at McMaster. My research is focused on women's housing and homelessness, and I'm really excited to share the work of the survey with you this afternoon. Khulud?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Khulud Baig. I am a housing policy advisor and researcher with the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network and Keepers of the Circle, which is an organization serving Indigenous women and gender diverse people. My pronouns are she and her, and really excited to share our work with everybody today.
Amazing, thank you. So we wanted to get started and just kind of lay out our agenda for the day to give you a sense of what we're going to be chatting about. So we'll get into what was the purpose of this work, how did we approach it methodologically, and for those of you who've looked at our report, we structured it around 10 key findings, and we're going to talk about 3 themes today that really stood out for us. So looking at housing affordability and adequacy, trauma and violence, but then also violations of the human right to housing, which kind of we saw across all of these themes. And then we're going to do a Q&A, and I just want to highlight you know, this survey was really large. We have a tremendous amount of data, so it'd be really helpful if folks can either write in the chat or questions their suggestions about where we can go with this data. We want to, in terms of next steps with analysis, ensure that we are kind of, to some extent, like crowdsourcing what will be meaningful for people who are doing this work to use in their advocacy and in their practice. So that's what we're going to be up to today. Before I get into that, maybe I'll give you a little bit of background on the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. What we are is a really diverse collective of women and gender diverse folks from across the country who just deeply believe it's possible to end homelessness for women, girls, and gender diverse folks, drawing on a whole range of expertise. I think I see our work as kind of having 2 big pillars. One is driving research in this area because it's enormously understudied and misunderstood in many ways, but then also really amplifying the voices of lived experts and hoping to ensure that lived experts are at the helm in terms of policy creation and solution building. And when I think of it, I guess I think of kind of like a figure 8, like there's a constant exchange between the research and lived expertise with a commitment to the human right to housing and a rights-based analysis kind of flowing through that. So that's what we're all about. If you haven't connected with us, please do so. And to introduce the survey, you know, there's a little bit of a trajectory that got us here. So when the network first formed, a range of folks said, you know, we don't have the information we need about the causes, consequences, and conditions of homelessness for women, girls, and gender diverse folks in Canada. As many of you know, I suspect partially related to the hidden nature of that homelessness. There just wasn't the kind of data that would enable us to do some of the advocacy we wanted to do. So gratefully, we received funding from CMHC to kind of do this 3-phase research project The first was to do a really robust literature review. We did a deep dive on public systems, which was really interesting. What are pathways from public systems into homelessness for women, girls, and gender diverse folks? Then today, what we're talking about is this phase 2 piece where we did a pan-Canadian survey, which was quite large, and Mary will describe what our methods were. And then the third phase, which Khulud is really spearheading in partnership with our Indigenous working group, is to build out a national research on Indigenous women, girls, gender diverse and two-spirited peoples, their unique experiences of homelessness, grounded in Indigenous methodologies and led by Indigenous scholars and communities. So that work is ongoing, and part of the findings from this survey, we are very grateful to be able to hand over to the Indigenous working group to kind of take up and use as they see fit or not, and because this is a critical area of our work at the network as well. Yeah, I think that probably is a good background, and I'll turn it to you, Mary.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So our research questions were really developed in partnership with a range of stakeholders, including lived experts, service providers, human rights experts, and researchers. And our survey sought to explore sort of the following questions. So we wanted to understand some of the key housing challenges faced by women and gender diverse people and how they navigate these difficulties. We wanted to learn more about the unique housing rights violations being experienced by women, girls, and gender diverse people, and also to learn about the barriers that these groups face when seeking justice. We were also really interested in learning about policy and practice change that's needed to effectively address homelessness and housing need for women, girls, and gender diverse people. We also wanted to learn about public systems, how things like child welfare, criminal justice contribute to and correlate with housing instability and homelessness in the lives of women, girls, and gender diverse people. Next slide, please. So our work was really grounded in a community-based and participatory methodology. Members of the Women's Network and the This Is Not Home project team worked collaboratively in an iterative process over several months to develop and revise and refine our data collection approach. So we worked with peer research associates from This Is Not Home and lived experts from the network who played an invaluable role in developing our survey questions. We also worked with the steering committee and several other groups through the network, including the research working group, the Indigenous Relations working group, to really sort of decide on what areas and key topics that the survey would focus on. And so we came up with the 5 points that we see on the screen around the right to adequate housing, gender-based discrimination with respect to housing, unique challenges of multi-marginalized groups, experiences in public systems and pathways into homelessness, and recommendations for all levels of government. Next slide, please. So our recruitment strategy really sought to gather a representative sample of women and gender diverse people across the country who were experiencing homelessness and housing precarity. So we worked with 27 community partner organizations, including shelters and housing providers in both the homelessness sector and VAW sector, in the youth sector, supportive housing programs, services for criminalized women, and peer-led harm reduction services. We also worked with lived experts, particularly with the intentions of recruiting folks who were not connected to those public systems, folks who were living in situations of hidden homelessness or more precarious housing. And we also were able to recruit folks through the network. Our network includes a lot of frontline workers who have direct contact with folks, and so they were able to share the survey with people that they were working with. Next slide, please. So there were, of course, a few limitations to our methodology, COVID being a huge barrier. So all of our data was collected during COVID-19, and our data was collected virtually. And this is because of research ethics put in place by York University's Research Ethics Board around in-person research. So we really can't stress enough how grateful we are for the community partners who helped us to make this work possible, to help us sort of move beyond some of the barriers and limitations of an online survey. So our community partners work to make technology available within their organizations. They work to help reduce barriers around literacy by supporting folks to participate in this survey. Really, we tried to make it also available for folks to complete the survey on Zoom or on the phone if barriers to the online method were presenting. We also had limited translation, so our survey was translated into English and French, but this likely prohibited the full participation of some newcomer participants. And due to the scale and depth of the data collected, an exhaustive report of the findings is not presented here. Specifically, findings related to Indigenous women and Two-Spirited people deserve a distinct analytical approach, which will be led by Indigenous scholars and community members. And a further intersectional analysis is needed to identify unique challenges that particular women and gender diverse people face when seeking adequate housing. Next slide.
Beautiful. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, I just want to emphasize again, like our community partners on this were wildly amazing. And our organizational partners, like we did this work in partnership with CAEH, the Observatory on Homelessness, obviously Keepers of the Circle, but also the Canadian Research Institute for the Advancement of Women. So huge thanks to all of you. So Mary's kind of laid out what our methodological approach was. It was, really trying to get across systems, across sectors, get at the hidden dimension of homelessness for women, and really engage lived experts to do some of this work. So what you see here is where we landed at a very high level in terms of our sample. We had 500 women and gender diverse folks participate in this survey. So 85 folks identified as cisgendered women, and there was a range of other kind of identifications in terms of gender. There was a lot of diversity in terms of sexuality. So 57% of folks identified as straight, but a huge percentage identified as bisexual. Other folks identified as asexual. So there's quite a range there, and really interesting findings related to that as well. In terms of race, we had about a third were Indigenous folks, 21% were persons of color, and almost 50% were folks who identified as white. What you also see there is kind of our age, the ages of folks that participated, and honestly, it was like a pretty good range. A majority are in that 25 to 49 year bracket, but then we also had some older women and gender diverse folks, which we were ecstatic about because there is really a lack of data for that group. Yeah, and then geographically, where we landed, just on the next slide. Thanks, Lindsay. Perfect. We actually worked in 12 provinces and territories. That gives you a sense of how many participants were across the country. We had at least 77 communities participate in the survey, so pretty diverse. Really tried to get that east to west, north to south regionalism in our work. Yeah, and so I think we could dive into the findings. Excited to share them with you. Khulud's going to be talking about our first one.
Awesome, thank you, Kaitlin. So we've decided to present our findings to you in 3 distinct themes, and the theme that I'm talking about is housing affordability and adequacy. And women and gender diverse people experience widespread and chronic housing affordability issues linked to low income. Sorry, Lindsay, can you move on to the next slide? I'm on. Perfect, awesome. So the first key finding I'm covering under this theme is the experiences of women and gender diverse people in terms of housing affordability issues being linked to low incomes. And despite this, many are not accessing government benefits they qualify for. And many of you probably are already pretty well aware in terms of housing affordability issues in your region and how they're impacting women and gender diverse people and their families. And according to 2016 census data, female-led households were more likely to be both below housing standard and in core housing need, with 35% of women-led households being below living standards in core housing need, or both. So this is really the existing research that we were working based off of. And next slide, please. And then when we look into the survey data that we found, our survey data says that the inability to afford a place was overwhelmingly reported as a reason for issues in finding a place. So a total of 60.2% of participants reported not being able to afford a place, and 46.5% reported not being able to afford a damage deposit, moving expenses, or utility hookups. So this really here is a key finding in terms of what is one of the biggest issues when in terms of people being able to access a stable housing tenure. And then most importantly, 75% of participants reported at least one affordability concern, and needless to say, housing affordability is deeply linked to income insecurity. So across the sample, only 11% reported being employed full-time, and a majority of the sample were receiving either social assistance or disability benefits. So that's around 60.8% of people. And importantly, however, it appeared that many participants who did qualify for assistance and could be using assistance to help them with housing affordability issues were not receiving it. So among participants over 65, particularly, 40% were not receiving senior benefits. And this is really where we see the crux of income insecurity issues and the link they have to housing affordability. Next slide, please. So we already know from existing research that Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people experience the most egregious housing conditions across Canada and remain the most underserved in VAW and homelessness sector. So we have existing research that shows that 20% of Indigenous women live in housing in need of major, 21% of Indigenous women, live in housing in need of major repairs, compared to 7% of non-Indigenous women. Indigenous women utilize homelessness shelters at 15 times the rate than non-Indigenous women, and Indigenous women are also represented in domestic violence shelters 5 times more by their representation in the Canadian population. And this existing research is further just echoed by our survey findings, which found that greater affordability issues were significantly correlated to factors such as identifying as Indigenous, involvement with child welfare system as a child or adult, multiple experiences of trauma, and experiences of disability. So there is a core aspect of compounding inequities and how they relate to then making affordability issues worse. And this finding, I just want to make a quick note here since we're talking about particularly Indigenous communities, this finding stands in support of the call to justice in the MMIWG report, so the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report, that emphasizes the urgency of the housing crisis impacting Indigenous women and gender diverse people, and calls upon all governments to immediately commence the construction of new housing and provision of repairs for existing housing to meet the needs for Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people. So construction and the call to justice further states that construction and provision of repairs must ensure that Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people have access to housing that is safe, appropriate to geographic and cultural needs, and available wherever they reside, whether in urban, rural, remote, or Indigenous communities. So this is just a really key point as we talk about housing affordability and adequacy. And women's housing stability overall cannot be ensured without taking holistic approaches. And I know as Mary and Kaitlin speak to their section, this is going to come up again and again. It's such a critical component. The holistic nature of housing is such a critical component to fixing issues and challenges in women's housing. So next slide, please. So the second key finding under housing affordability and adequacy themes states that women and gender diverse people experience a wide range of housing adequacy and suitability issues, with safety issues being a common concern that undermine housing stability. So this particularly rings true for me. I'm based out of Ottawa and have done some significant work in the municipality, and have listened to lived experts who have often talked about having to leave their housing due to dire repair situations or lack of safety for themselves and their kids. And 27.8% of participants were forced to leave their most recent house due to issues with conditions of the place. So next slide, please. So our findings on housing conditions state that over 70% of women and gender diverse people reported at least one problem with the condition of their current and most recent housing, and almost a third reported 3 or more problems. And issues included pests, units being too small for their family, units being too hot or too cold. And these adequacy issues were in addition to health and safety issues identified by participants, with almost 52.2% of people identifying at least one issue, and a third reporting more than 3 issues with health and safety. Next slide, please. Safety issues were particularly significant for participants as well, with 45.8% of women reporting at least one type of safety concern within their housing. And among safety issues, a number of participants discussed violence, abuse, and harassments from landlords. Importantly, a third of participants, that's 33.3% of the participants, reported that COVID-19 had made their housing situation worse, with 11% reporting being stuck in an unsafe situation and 8% reporting becoming homeless. Next slide, please. So the third and final finding I'll be speaking to under the affordability theme states that the chronicity and depth of poverty experienced by women and gender diverse people leads to many persons employing multiple subsistence strategies each month. In many cases, this contributed to increased debt and chronic housing need. And this finding really speaks to what we refer to as feminization of poverty in our research, which speaks to the disparity in poverty levels, wherein women are more likely to live on low incomes than men, and particularly groups of women particular groups of women are much more likely to have low incomes, including racialized women, women with disabilities, and particularly single-family households, with around 42% of women-led families being on low income. Next slide, please. So this is the slide, shows that breakdown really well. And the data from the survey indicated that in their most current or most recent place, women and gender diverse people had an average of around $600 left over after paying for their housing. And this amount would need to cover a range of necessities, including food, transportation, medical necessities, necessities for children, clothing, cell phone, internet, hygiene, and a lot of other costs. And unsurprisingly, 61% of participants said that they did not have enough money for necessities after paying for their housing. Next slide, please. Thank you. So given the depth of poverty many participants face, a majority reported engaging in a range of strategies to make ends meet. Almost a third were relying on food banks. Almost 1 in 10 engaged in sex work, so that's 8.4%. And on average, participants engaged in 2 additional subsistence strategies each month, with over a third engaged in 3 or more strategies. And particular one, I think, which does catch my eye as well, is 36% relying on borrowed money, skip bills, or having to go to cash marts to access extra cash. Next slide, please. Awesome. So where do we go from here? And I think this is a bit of a hopeful part after some of the findings that we've seen. So, you know, findings really imply a whole bunch of things. We know that affordability issues are rising from erosion of naturally occurring affordable housing stock, financialization of housing markets, long wait lists of social housing. In Ottawa, we are looking at 12-year wait lists, really, inadequate social assistance rates, and the failure of income to keep up with soaring cost of housing. And really, as housing is becoming more unaffordable, incomes are failing to lift people out of poverty, and women are being disproportionately hit by even during the pandemic by sharpest job losses and then slowest economic recovery. So we're calling on all levels of government to take action. The federal government can play a significant role in expanding and increasing investments in eviction preventions through benefits like federal residential tenant support benefit. And these sort of investments back into people can mean that people can be caught at those points and those pathways that lead them into homelessness. I know Kaitlin's going to be speaking a lot to the human rights-based approach to housing, and will probably be elaborating on the importance of having a rights-based approach when looking at policy approaches to address homelessness for women and gender diverse people. And most importantly, the federal government can look into development and expansion of low-income rent subsidies for women, girls, and gender diverse people to help them with not having to face issues in paying rent and keeping long-term stable housing. We need to address financialization of housing in Canada. And I was just watching a video yesterday that talked about how Canada's the most expensive housing market in G7 countries. And it's really surprising because, you know, even something like Japan, which is supporting a huge population, is way lower than what Canada and Canadians are currently seeing in housing prices. At provincial levels, we can look at making housing conditions better, particularly for people experiencing disabilities, through looking at universal design principles and incorporating those in all building codes and making it incumbent upon anybody who's developing to incorporate those design principles. And then some amazing work can happen at local level. And this is something that I particularly feel passionate about. There's a lot of power to be cultivated in local settings. We're calling upon, you know, cities and localities to look at land and infrastructure and buildings to create rapid affordable housing initiatives for women and gender diverse people who are experiencing the greatest level of need, to look at initiatives such as rent guaranteed income housing, supportive housing, and housing particularly by and for Indigenous women and gender diverse people. We can look at landlord registries to make sure that quality and condition of rental units is being kept up to a certain standard and people are not living in below standard housing. And most importantly, we can look at really rigorous standards to define affordable housing within municipal contexts and really going off of definitions that fit local contexts and the experiences of people in those contexts. So that's it from my part. I'll pass it on to Mary now, and thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. So the theme that I'm going to be covering is violence and trauma. And we know that violence and trauma is both a pathway into homelessness for women, girls, and gender diverse people, and a consequence of experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. So one of the key findings from our survey is that homelessness begins early in life for a majority of women and gender diverse people. It is often followed by a chronic, chaotic churn of precarious housing and homeless situations. Next slide, please. So we learned that 43.8% of the participants in our survey had experienced 3 or more precarious housing situations in the last year alone. And we also learned that 44% of our participants had experienced homelessness for the first time before the age of 19. So this goes to show that homelessness is often something that's reoccurring in the lives of women, girls, and gender diverse people who experience homelessness in this country. Next slide, please. And this is an image from the literature review that Kaitlin referenced at the beginning. And it really does a nice job of painting the picture of hidden homelessness for women, girls, and gender diverse people. And we kept this sort of front of mind when we were doing our recruitment as well. We know that precarious housing and homelessness situations is often hidden, and that people experience homelessness for a considerable amount of time before interacting with some of the public systems. Next slide, please. Women and gender diverse people experiencing housing need and homelessness reported high exposure to trauma and violence, with 75% of our participants identifying as a survivor of trauma or abuse. Exposure to trauma and violence is a central feature of homelessness for women and gender diverse people. Violence often begins early in life and continues once women are on the streets, which leads to experiences of hidden forms of homelessness. Women and gender diverse people experiencing housing need and homelessness reported a high exposure to trauma and violence. Over 1 in 10 of our participants reported being involved in human trafficking, and over a quarter, so 27.8%, had child welfare involvement as a child or youth. Next slide, please. So we asked participants about their experiences over the life course, and really our findings on the experiences over the life course highlight the importance of using a trauma-informed approach and harm reduction approach in the public systems that are seeking to prevent and respond to issues of homelessness. Cross-system support that assists individuals transitioning from child welfare or criminal justice systems are critical to bridging the gaps for women and gender diverse people who are most vulnerable to violence and trauma. So we see on this graph, 75% of folks were suggested that they were survivors of abuse or trauma, with 44% having had encounters with the criminal justice system. And we can see the child welfare involvement, both as a child and as an adult, are well over 1/4 of participants. Next slide, please. We also know that experiences of violence, control, discrimination, and harassment were common with cohabitants. So participants reported experiencing significant levels of violence, control, harassment, and discrimination perpetrated by the people that they lived with almost half of the sample reporting some form of violence in their current or most recent home. So 28.4% of participants reported being forced to move out of their most recent housing because they did not feel it was safe for themselves or for their children. And we know that particular forms of violence at home were higher for some groups. For example, gender diverse people reported higher rates of arguments and fights and physical conflict, threats, or assault in the home. Histories of gender-based violence were reported by participants accessing services in both the homelessness sector and the VAW sector, suggesting that these experiences are pervasive for those who engage with either system. There really is a need to work towards dismantling the silos that exist between the VAW sector and the gender-based housing and homelessness serving organizations, because we know that folks experiencing violence are interacting with both systems. Next slide, please. And another key finding that we found was that women and gender diverse people experience significant barriers to accessing emergency services and emergency shelter beds, with almost 1/3 reporting being unable to access a bed when they needed one. Next slide. And so we know that emergency shelters are underfunded and overcrowded. We know from recent data collected from the 2018 point in time count that there is a significant lack of gender-specific beds available across this country, and that availability is experienced in different ways depending on where you were located within this country. Next slide, please. In addition to a lack of access to shelter beds and the system being underfunded and overtapped, we also identified 3 key barriers to service, which included discrimination, eligibility, and suitability. So folks shared with us in the narrative component of our survey some of the reasons in which they felt they were not able to access a shelter bed. And we found that sometimes this was for other reasons than just the beds were full. Next slide, please. We also asked participants what happens what have they done when they've been turned away from accessing a shelter bed. And we found out that 1 in 5 of our participants were barred or service restricted from accessing emergency shelter beds in their own communities. Our survey highlighted that women and gender diverse folks were more likely to be barred or service restricted. And so we learned that participants that had had child welfare involvement, both as a child and as an adult, had reported being barred from shelters at 26.7% compared to 12.5%. And those identifying as having mental health challenges reported being barred from shelters at 81.7% compared to 58% of folks who did not identify as having mental health concerns. In addition to severe capacity issues that are well documented, personal accounts indicate that shelters can exacerbate the very needs that they're meaning to address. Shelter policies relating to substance use, pets, and living on site with adult children often fail to employ a trauma-informed and harm reduction approach, resulting in women and gender diverse people being turned away from services. Next slide, please. There are a number of recommendations for all levels of government based on the findings from our survey. So we recommend that that the federal government work with partners to develop a national definition of homelessness and housing affordability that genuinely reflects the unique causes, conditions, and experiences of homelessness and housing need for women, girls, and gender diverse people. Specifically, we recommend that this is done in consultation with Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited people, and that through this definition, we work to streamline definitions of violence against women to include intimate partner violence, family violence, and other experiences of sexual and physical violence due to homelessness, exploitation, and poverty. At the provincial level, we hope that the governments will adopt policies and practices that will lead to improved collaboration within the VAW sector, the homelessness sector, and the housing sector. We hope that they will create provincial and territorial housing and shelter standards to meet the diverse needs of women and gender diverse people experiencing homelessness or housing precarity, and that these shelter standards be developed in partnership with lived experts and Indigenous communities. And at the local level, we hope that local governments will work to conduct an intersectional policy audit of existing homeless services and shelters to identify gaps in safety and service delivery impacting gender diverse people and women who are experiencing homelessness. And we hope that this will lead to a more accessible and secure spaces and more spaces within the shelter system. I will end it there and thank you and pass it to Kaitlin.
Amazing, thank you. As I was listening to you, I was just thinking about like the incredible resilience and resistance that we know women and gender diverse folks have to kind of endure the kind of trauma that we're talking about. So just a quick story, like recently, The Shift, where the organization I work with, we did a research site visit to a major city looking at encampments, and I met with a woman who gave me permission to disclose this, who shared, I went into her encampment, and kind of to go in, I had to step over, it was like a measuring tape that had been spooled out and kind of folded up. And I asked her, oh, like, can you tell me a little bit about this? And she said, yeah, that is so that at night, if someone enters near my tent, I can hear it crinkle, and she'll be alerted to a possible risk to her safety. And it just really demonstrated to me the kind of ever-present threats of violence that many women live with while they're experiencing homelessness. And just, yeah, I mean, to my point, to what I'm going to be speaking about, just the tremendous human rights violations that underpin all of this data we're talking about. What is very cool, and I imagine many of you know, we adopted housing federal legislation that identified housing as a human right for the first time in Canada in 2019. It's called the National Housing Strategy Act. If you don't know about it, integrate it into your life. It is a new landscape, I think, for us to be doing advocacy around these issues. So if you're a service provider or an advocate, this is actually going to be a really, really important avenue for change and for policy change as well. So I'm going to talk about a few of the findings that I think, are really important for understanding why is this a human rights issue? What do we do with it? So thinking about our first finding, yeah, perfect. Thanks, Lindsay. This is really interesting. One of the things we did is we asked participants, okay, why did you lose your housing the last time? And we gave folks like a whole range of reasons. It could have been a health crisis, like affordability issues, eviction, loss of job, moving, like many options. But we found that the majority of people lost their housing because of a breakup. So 47% of the sample had lost their housing. This was the top reason. It was beyond affordability, beyond all of these other factors I mentioned. And yeah, Lindsay, if you could show our graph there. Yeah, perfect. So this kind of gives you a sense of what we asked folks. And I think, it's really important to understand about this finding is that we have a group of people whose housing depends on remaining in some kind of personal relationship with another person, with a man or with someone else. And that women and gender diverse folks are essentially experiencing kind of chronic informal evictions from housing that they're in. And if they're not, many of these women or others are kind of being forced to stay in the situation they're in so they don't lose their housing. And I think we really need to understand this as a human rights issue. Certainly the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing has kind of spoken to this really beautifully and said, women's rights to own, manage, enjoy property is really central to their human right to housing and to their independence. So we do have a group of people that on the basis of their gender or in relation to their gender are being denied access to control over their housing, have real gaps in terms of security of housing. And the consequences for folks that are, being forced out of their housing because of a breakup are also significant. Lots of folks lose property, they lose their pets, they lose connection with family, with children, with services, kind of you name it. So, we talk about a lot of the human rights dimensions of evictions, for example, but this is a kind of a somewhat hidden, huge human rights issue, in my opinion. And it's really important for us in terms of thinking about how we prevent homelessness for women and gender diverse folks. And on the next slide, there's a couple of quotes that I wanted to highlight too, because this is also related to kind of public system failure. So just to read a couple of these, we had a person say, "My aggressor was removed from the home, but I lost my housing as a result and became homeless. My husband went to prison and our house was auctioned off as a fine." So there's actually public system failures that are also occurring that are creating these pathways into eviction combined with these breakups. And, you know, I guess my point is we need to understand that as a key human rights issue that's facing women and gender diverse folks across the country. Okay, and I'd like to turn to evictions now. What we did see, kind of unsurprisingly, as many of you would expect, so eviction's a common experience for women and gender diverse folks who end up without housing. But we really saw the extent to which folks could not access legal supports or advice about this. Some of you on this call might be in services that provide these supports. Man, they are so important and so necessary, and this is a population who's really struggling to accessing those supports. We asked people, you know, what happened when you couldn't get access to legal supports? And I wanted to highlight a couple of quotes from people about, you know, the consequences of that. So someone just wrote in, "I had a baby and was in the hospital and was evicted while they're in the hospital with their child." This story is also really important. "I went to see a lawyer for help when my son was 18 months old, and she told me that I was a terrible mother for doing that, and I was trying to poison my son against his father. I had no one to babysit and no help and could not control the appointment time. I left feeling humiliated and dejected and shamed, and was not able to escape for another 10 years after that." So, I mean, in these stories, we're talking about the impact on women, but we're also talking about like intergenerational impacts, the impacts this has on children, which is so important. So the trajectory for, in this case, the stories of these two folks who shared those stories, that the child's trajectory, certainly what we know is that, you know, these kind of experiences of eviction or in this case, perhaps abuse in the home, contribute to child welfare involvement. Kids who are in child welfare are 192 times more likely to experience homelessness. If you look at data on chronic homelessness, most folks experienced it as a young person. So there's a very direct relationship between what we're doing in terms of intervening when young moms or single moms are facing an eviction and their children's trajectory into homelessness, including kind of lifelong experiences of homelessness. And yeah, next slide, Lindsay, would be great. Thank you. Yeah, again, I mean, I guess just pointing to some of these system failures as well. This is a group who, yeah, it's just being tremendously failed by the ways in which various systems are combining. So as some of you will know, for example, if a woman and her child are in social housing and her child is apprehended by child welfare, she's immediately considered overhoused, and she may have to leave her housing. Then for her to try to get housing again and reunite with her child, it's extremely difficult because she needs to have another room for her child. So anyway, it's the ways in which these systems intersect. This was true in our literature review, and it really was clear in our data as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay, great. The other thing I think, you know, from a human rights lens, obviously what we want to be thinking about and talking about is discrimination. We saw in our survey that discrimination from landlords and property managers really was very common, and in some cases resulted in pretty disastrous effects, including housing loss and just exits into homelessness and long-term homelessness. And the kinds of discrimination we're talking about includes like sexual harassment, experiences that are very gendered, and in some cases related to kind of intersecting forms of discrimination on the basis of ability, race, gender, all of those factors. Next slide, please. Thanks, Lindsay. So 80% of folks identified as having experienced at least one form of discrimination from a landlord or property manager. So this is really high. 16% said they actually had to move out because of this discrimination or harassment. So we are creating a pipeline. You know, we talk about pipelines into homelessness from public systems. It's also true that landlords and property managers are creating pipelines into homelessness as a result of their discriminatory behavior or their harassment. What was interesting and important in the data that I just really want to briefly highlight is this was super true for LGBTQ2S folks. So that population, yes, they're experiencing discrimination on the basis of their sexual orientation, but they were also more likely to experience discrimination on the basis of their appearance, on the basis of their source of income, on the basis of whether they had criminal justice involvement. So you have these intersecting ways in which discriminatory beliefs that are held by landlords and property managers are further marginalizing groups that experience kind of intersecting forms of oppression. And you know, in terms of our legal system and our ability to address that, the mechanisms at the provincial and territorial level are pretty weak in terms of understanding this as a human rights violation. But I think our data really demonstrates the importance of that lens and just our need to work on this in a pretty urgent way. And then the final finding I wanted to share with you is something that is very important, and I think in many ways was I think quite surprising, actually. So next slide, Lindsay. What we found is that 79% of folks who participated in our survey identified as having at least one disability. So this is a really high number. Part of this might be attributed to the fact that a good chunk, about a quarter, or rather a half of the sample were folks who were accessing low barrier shelters and drop-ins, who might be experiencing more complex forms of marginalization. Having said that, we saw amongst those who we connected with through other services or through situations of hidden homelessness, we saw similar levels of disability. So if you go to the next slide, Lindsay, you can see here we asked folks, do you identify as having any of these conditions that are disabling to you in your daily life? And so on average, actually, people said the average was having 3 disabilities, and some folks identified as much as 11 disabilities. And I know we've been throwing a lot of numbers at you, but I want to emphasize a couple of things. The first is a lot of folks who identified as having disability are not accessing, as Khulud said, are not accessing the benefits they might qualify for. So 63% are receiving a disability benefit, the rest are not. Folks with disabilities really struggle to access shelter beds at roughly twice the rate of people without disabilities. Folks with physical disabilities had huge challenges around like the physical accessibility of shelters, getting transportation to shelters. And so, as we're thinking about this, and we're doing right now actually a deep dive on these findings and this research, because the data is really complicated and really important, including, for example, around brain injury. There was like high rates of reports of brain injury, and we know that what I've understood is that sometimes brain injury can present as other issues that shelters or drop-ins don't understand, and then folks get misunderstood or not connected with the right services and support. So anyway, all of that's to say, if this is an area of interest to you, please connect with us, because this data is really important. And from a human rights lens, it does require that we do an audit, I think, in the sector around, are we continuing to marginalize people with disabilities? Where are we creating barriers for access to supports, to access to income supports, and including physical accessibility of our spaces? It's just so critical given what we know about the kind of violence and trauma that can happen on the streets when folks with disabilities can't get into a shelter, but more importantly, can't get into adequate housing. Yeah, great. So last slide. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Oh yeah. Oh great. I covered this. Sorry, next slide. Yeah, great. Okay. So quickly, few kind of key recommendations. As you all know, there's a whole range of programs within the National Housing Strategy. What I think we're very interested in seeing is equitable funding for women, girls, and gender diverse folks across Canada in the National Housing Strategies, but not just that, also targeted investments for this group, for those who are most in need. So one of the things, we did, yeah, for policy wonks out there, please read this because it's actually, I loved doing it. It was a policy analysis, like a rights-based GBA plus analysis of the National Housing Strategy. And we looked at each of these programs through a human rights lens. And what you see in a lot of these programs is, like, for example, the affordability metrics are really, really very disappointing. So, for example, you have programs where the federal government is funding a developer. They only need to make 10% of the units they create affordable. What constitutes affordable is 80% of median or average rent in the area. So the groups we're talking about here, that housing is so out of reach, it's ridiculous. Like that, we're talking about women, girls, gender diverse folks who can afford to pay $100, $200, and so we are, through the National Housing Strategy, funding a lot of programs that are not meeting the needs of women and gender diverse folks who are in the kind of core housing need we're talking about. So we need to be doing kind of rights-based budgeting and thinking about how we're funding these programs. So this is the key. If you know me, I feel like I'll be going on about this for ages. Highlighting again, the many points that Khulud made, there's an urgent need, obviously, to realize the right to housing for Indigenous women, girls, gender diverse, and two-spirited folks. The calls to justice and the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls in that report are so detailed, so amazing, so brilliant. I think that we should be thinking about the success or failure of the National Housing Strategy Act and the National Housing Strategy in terms of whether it is actually producing different housing outcomes for these groups. Third, related to this first point that I talked about, this kind of lack of security of tenure and this informal evictions through breakups, what we really want to see and advance quickly is home ownership and kind of primary leaseholding amongst women and gender diverse people. The kind of security that creates is critical in terms of well-being long-term. And finally, across all of these findings that we've talked about, public systems, again, have kind of emerged as key pathways into trauma, into violence, into homelessness. So when we think about human rights, we need to be, utilizing human rights standards when we think about systems like criminal justice or child welfare, the right for folks not to be discharged into homelessness from rehab centers or from hospitals. I think, yeah, the homelessness sector and VW sector kind of needs to be ringing that bell very loudly with public systems, because obviously homelessness is a policy fusion issue and requires us to do this cross-sector stuff. Yeah, but just finally, I'll say, we are in this new landscape with the National Housing Strategy Act. I know so many folks are thinking about their work more from a human rights lens, increasingly including folks who are doing frontline practice. And yeah, just excited to have a conversation with all of you about these findings. Yeah, so maybe we'll turn to the Q&A. What I would suggest too, and I think I said this at the beginning, please feel free. We're not actually able to see the comments, but please feel free to send in the messages what you'd like to see us do next with the data, because we want this data and research to be meaningful to people on the ground who are doing the work, and to reflect the realities of lived experts and people who are kind of working alongside in an allyship with them. So thank you so much. That's the end of our presentation. We have like 30 minutes, so just like pepper us with all the questions you got.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kaitlin and Mary and Khulud. So much data to go over, and I'm sure some of the data was a shock to some folks on the call, and unfortunately, I'm sure some of the data was not a shock. But yeah, let's transfer into the Q&A discussion. We do have a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. So the first question that that we'll talk about is a question that comes from Karen B. And Karen's question is about female veterans. So were female veterans included in the kind of collection, the data collection, and what findings, if they were unique about that group?
Yes, great question. Hi, Karen. Thanks so much for being here. We didn't do an intentional recruitment strategy around veterans, as I suspect, because you probably know there's such limited research in this area. And so we are in dire need of research focusing on women veterans and gender diverse veterans. We looked at, I don't know that we asked folks if they identified as veterans, but we looked at who was receiving veteran benefits, and it was very, very minimal. So I suspect we only, it was, I believe it was like 0.2%. So it only would have been 1 or 2 participants. So not enough participants to be statistically significant. But I guess all of that is to say further research in that area is going to be really critical. And perhaps Karen, you might be working in this area, and yeah, us at the Women's Network would be looking out for work and collaboration for sure. I mean, Khulud and Mary, do you have thoughts on this?
Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. I just was reminded about this webinar that was done by Arlene, who's the co-chair for the steering committee with a group. It's called Respect Canada, and they particularly looked at veteran homelessness for women and gender diverse veteran homelessness. And exactly what you're saying, Kaitlin, one of the biggest challenges is how little is known about it, and the starting point kind of needs to be in terms of looking at some very focused data collection intervention in terms of where to start and what are some experiences or what are some points where we can collect that data and get some better understanding of it. All that to say, I don't know, Karen, if you are with Respect Canada or know about them, they're doing some amazing work around it. And I do think there's a possibility even to, if there are organizations interested in collaborating with the network, to look at something really focused on veterans and seeing how we can kind of take this research and branch it into a very focused project on veteran homelessness.
Okay, great, thank you. So we're getting lots of questions flooding in. So let's stay on this topic around populations. So Emily H is wondering about rural areas. So was there any data collected in rural areas, and anything notable to share about why or why not?
Yes, absolutely. Enormously helpful. Thank you so much. We absolutely did a lot of outreach to rural areas, including in remote areas as well. We haven't actually done a breakdown on differences across across regions and across urban versus rural. I mean, Khulud and Mary, you folks might have thoughts on, based on the research, what you know, but we haven't analyzed that data yet. But that's really helpful as something that we need to think about. Certainly the rural context around homelessness is extremely unique. Not extremely unique, but I mean, it's quite a unique, homelessness presents in unique ways, and the kind of hidden homelessness that you see in rural areas, I think, is distinct as well. Khulud and Mary, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Just to say, quite a few of our participants from Eastern Canada were living in rural areas. We worked with one particularly keen outreach worker who was able to recruit folks who were living in a range of small rural areas. And I think it would definitely be worth doing sort of a data snapshot on folks who were living in rural parts of the country, particularly in terms of access to services and barriers to support.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I just wanted to make a quick note also on information from the north and the lack of emergency services in the north, and like how that impacts particularly women who are trying to exit violent situations. And I think it might be really interesting, and that was one thing that I think all of us had talked about, is to do follow-up snapshots, because this is such a huge, rich data size that there are some ways that we can kind of look at some particular comparisons. And I wonder if looking at rural and north might be one of those follow-up snapshots or briefs that we can probably look into.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so just so everyone on the call knows, over the next kind of coming months, on like weekly or bi-weekly, every 2 weeks, we're going to be releasing kind of 2-3 pagers on particular populations. So if you have requests about, I really need data on older women or Black women in a particular region or nationally, please let us know, because that will help us understand what the need is.
Yeah, and there are a lot of folks on the call who are asking about access to all of these reports. So I just want to let everyone know, when we send you the follow-up email with the webinar recording and the PowerPoint slides, and everyone who's on the call here today will get that email, we'll also make sure to link to all of the reports that were mentioned throughout the presentation. So the report here about the survey, the policy analysis reports, and anything else that kind of, as a panel, you feel would be relevant to these folks. So there were a lot of people asking about access to resources, so we'll make sure that you have all of that access. And we'll also make sure that you have information about how to get in touch with folks panel about, if you have ideas or you need specific data. So we'll make sure that you have all of that information, not to worry there. So to dive back into some questions from the audience, we have Julia G asks, you mentioned that women in need are not accessing the government benefits that they are eligible for. So can you talk to some of the findings that might have pointed to reasons why those benefits are not being accessed?
Yeah, great question. Sorry, I feel like I'm dominating. Khulud and Mary, you folks go ahead.
You start right ahead, Kaitlin, and I'll jump in. No worries.
Okay.
But Mary, if you want to start as well.
Yeah, I really wish we had asked this question specifically. We asked people what happened when you couldn't get shelter, or what happened when you couldn't get legal supports, but we didn't specifically ask why couldn't you access income supports. What we do know from, or other kinds of benefits, what we do know from the literature, so a huge number of folks don't know what supports are out there. This is true. I used to work in youth homelessness quite a lot, and in the youth homelessness population, for example, a vast majority of youth, when they become homeless, didn't know youth homelessness was a thing, didn't know there are youth homeless shelters, including young women and gender diverse folks. So just the lack of information that people have about what kind of benefits are out there, how to qualify for them, navigating the process of application, so all the kind of standard stuff around access to a computer. If you're fleeing violence and your partner has your banking information, or has frozen it, or has hacked into it, having an address through which to receive the materials you need to process income supports, for example. I think those are certainly all things that we see in the research literature around this. Yeah, there's going to be others, Mary, include, I mean, Mary, you do a whole range of frontline work. You may have a sense of what you're seeing from folks there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really ties to our finding around, this sort of chronic, chaotic sort of churn of precarious housing and homelessness situations over the life course, and that folks maybe have not been able to sort of stay in one spot long enough to get the rigorous bureaucratic processes done needed to qualify for something like, I'm here in Ontario, so to qualify for something like ODSP. As Kaitlin mentioned, yeah, I've worked 10 years frontline and, have certainly supported folks who would qualify for ODSP, but without access to a regular family doctor, without someone really supporting through that process, without an address to receive the forms, I think people get lost. Like this kind of stuff sometimes gets lost when people are living in such sort of survival mode, which many of our participants were.
Yeah, for sure.
I just quickly also wanted to add, I think we have some stuff on why people have not been able to access legal supports. And I feel like if you extrapolate some of that information, what we really come across is the navigation piece and like navigating the different bureaucratic pathways to getting the support that's needed. And as well, having to prove all the different things, because I think and there's amazing research already on social assistance systems themselves and how they're just wrought with policies that are so mean tested and so that put so many barriers in the way of people that really deserve and need the benefits. So even if people know there's something wrong and they can be accessing something, the navigation of system itself is so difficult. And that's kind of a larger, that kind of ties into the larger finding about other public systems that intersect with housing and homelessness, and how it kind of makes housing more challenging for people if they are already facing these other challenges within other public systems. So hopefully, this research kind of really amplifies some amazing work and research that's done through on social assistance systems in Canada.
Yeah, I love that point too, and I'm thinking about the quote that I read too by the person who talked about going to ask for legal help and then having this really just like dismissive and hurtful interaction with the person they were engaged with. And I think that's also in some cases a really common experience of people kind of reaching out to systems and then having these really negative interactions and then just not going back for help, or just, being told they don't qualify, they don't count, why don't they just kind of pull it together. Getting those kind of messages from various officials or staff, across the board, and people kind of, understandably not wanting to engage with the system and go through experiences of degradation, I think is also, I think it's important to understand that as well.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Really rich responses to these questions. Thank you, panel. So we have a question about data and data collection, and that comes from Rachel B. And Rachel is wondering if you could talk about your sample size and over what length of time the data was collected, and how did you collect data and interview respondents? I think, Mary, you had talked a little bit about methodology, so maybe we'll throw that to you.
So our sample size was 500. So we were able to sample 500 participants from across the country. We used an online survey tool. We developed it using a tool called Qualtrics. So it was a website link and folks sort of accessed it and it took you through the survey. It had, as you see, like lots of multiple choice, but then also lots of fill in the sort of short answer questions. Folks always had the opportunity to say prefer not to answer and they could still sort of move through the survey. And so we worked with community organizations to make that link available. We also worked with low barrier drop-in programs. So with peer researchers using sort of a device on site in these low barrier drop-ins to fill the survey out with folks who were interested. And everyone who participated received an honorarium gift card to a store to a place of their choice. Yeah, so it was really like Kaitlin and I, like couldn't stress enough like this the thank you to the community partners who did this in the middle of COVID, no less, and really took the time to make this what seemed like what wasn't a very accessible methodology for this particular population as accessible as it could be to get, yeah, as we said, 500 participants.
Yeah, one of the things we also had, or some staff were amazing and did, was sit with someone and then read out the questions to them, and the staff person would fill it in, so that literacy wasn't necessarily a barrier, and kind of try to give folks a lot of time and space to complete it at their own pace. Yeah, and so, there were devices in the shelters or drop-ins or other services, but then people could access it on their phones. They could access it at home if they did have a device of some kind. So not ideal in the sense of, it's really, ideally we'd also have paper surveys in addition, like that were translated as well. We did have it in French and English, but COVID, man, it'll get you. We'll get you on the data collection side. But yeah, that's what we were up to. And again, trying to work in the VAW sector, work in the homelessness sector, work in harm reduction spaces, we worked with lived experts who had quite broad networks, and they were able to reach out to their networks, or yeah, so that was kind of where we landed with our methodology.
And I am just realizing I forgot to answer one part of the question, which asked what the time frame for data collection was. So we started data collection at the very end of December, took a bit of a break around the holiday, and then wrapped it up within the first week of February. So we collected data for about 4 weeks. It's important to note that we ended up turning folks away due to the limited funding for honorariums. So we were still getting emails, sort of weeks after people wanting to participate, but the survey had closed. We had reached 500 participants shockingly quickly, which is disheartening.
Yeah. Great, thank you for that response. We're going to shift a little bit to, I guess, more of a solution focus. Rosemary S. asked if there's any thought of looking into land trusts and other measures to preserve adequate housing in perpetuity.
Yay, Rosemary. Great idea. Well, I mean, it's, yeah, very exciting. Khulud, I don't know, I feel like you probably have a bunch of great thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's a huge passion area, just because I think that, well, recently CMHC announced this funding through their demonstration initiative, encouraging people to apply for land trust funding, which really means that, there is this sort of a national movement towards establishing and looking at land trusts as a way to get land to build affordable housing. And when we particularly working in the area of working with Indigenous women and gender diverse people and looking at pathways to permanent, long-term, stable housing for them, I think the question of land is very critical and key. And what we've been doing at Keepers of the Circle is really looking at how can we build capacity and enable Indigenous women in regions across Canada to collectively have land through a land trust, and then utilize it not just for housing, but then, as the survey proves, for so many other things that are peripheral to housing. So, growing food, or, having services, or being located around services, or having, different models of community living. So I think land trusts, particularly in the space of offering affordable housing, really open this new horizon of what's possible and what can be done, and how many people can actually be involved in the process of it, right? So it's really exciting, and I really hope that it takes on in a way that's community-led and community-based, and that it doesn't get co-opted by just a few to kind of, again, make it into a measure of attaining land and speculating on land. So I really hope that communities across Canada are just kind of looking into it and seeing how they can organize within their regions. But it offers some amazing opportunity, particularly in big cities as well. And I think some successful work is being done by Parkdale in Toronto, obviously, and then Vancouver, that has a sector-led land trust.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been thinking about this. And it's like, I mean, I hesitate to even say it, but interestingly, the Conservative government in their policy, in their platform, during the elections said, you know, we're going to we want to allocate 15% of federal lands to build housing. They didn't specify affordable housing, but you know, the federal government has huge assets in terms of land that could be allocated. So doing the local land trusts is amazing. I mean, Parkdale's amazing. There's beautiful models across the country where that work's been done and done in such a deep participatory way. And as we think about building out these solutions, I just think, you know, the federal government has kind of the largest resources and has the capacity to be allocating itself large parcels of land for land trusts that can be community owned, community driven, ensure affordability and perpetuity. And in our particular area that we work, like ensuring that there is gender equity in terms of leadership, ownership of that housing, and inclusion in those communities. So love that, Rosemary. Thank you so much. I think it's, yeah, from my perspective, it's a huge opportunity for us in Canada. Mary, I don't know if you have other thoughts too.
No, that was perfect. Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you. We're going to switch now into areas for future research. We have a couple of people who put in some insights.
Right.
Yeah, so Sally writes, for a follow-up and for a future webinar or a report, I would be really interested to hear more about the adaptations that are required to better respond to the needs of women with disabilities. It's something that they're looking into where Sally is in Montreal. I don't know if the three of you have any comments about plans for that kind of work, or maybe places where you know that work is already happening.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's super exciting you're doing that work, Sally, because I just feel, yeah, our data just points to the urgency of it. I mean, certainly there's a range of organizations like Dawn Canada who would have expertise in that area. What we are doing at the moment is doing a closer look at the disability data right now. So running a range of analyses that I think will be helpful for service providers or housing providers, and going to get that data out the door. And I think we should, I mean, I'm just committing to us doing this right now, but I think we should do like a roundtable specifically on the gender disability data and solution generation and what that looks like including building standards. You know, speaking for myself, that's not an area I know very much about, but I am increasingly coming to understand the ways in which we've constructed building standards are enormously discriminatory and exclusionary for folks with disabilities. So let's bring some folks together and have that discussion. Really love that.
Yeah, just a quick note as well, Kaitlin, about folks with disabilities that are invisible and are completely being missed by some of the policies at emergency support services, and looking into what are better ways of serving and making sure that supportive housing as well as services are being offered to catch those people as well and not have them fall into gaps and cracks.
Yeah, for sure.
Great, thank you. And then we have Rosemary, who has been putting in lots of great comments and questions in the chat box. But Rosemary was wondering if there's any interest in expanding your data collection to outside of Canada. So Rosemary mentioned that there's some great work happening around that in South Africa. Rosemary also shared a link to that, to where you can find that work. So Rosemary, just so you know, I will make sure that the panelists have access to this link so they can check that out. But yeah, the question to the panels is whether or not there's plans to expand this outside of Canada.
Also amazing question. That's so great. I mean, at the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network, we're a pretty young crew, kind of standing, I think, to some extent on the shoulders of a range of folks who've come before us, who've been doing this great gender-focused housing analysis and advocacy. But I see us, especially as I think about like us focusing on human rights work, like the importance of that connecting, us doing international advocacy work and like sharing around data, around measures around the world, and connecting with women's activist groups and movements around the world as being really, really important. I'm super excited to check out what you sent us around South Africa. We don't have specific plans around this. Definitely need a funder to back us to help make that happen, or some core funding, or kind of something. We're pretty scrappy at the moment, but would be so eager to do that, and would appreciate connections that any of you might want to make with us regarding that.
Great. So there's a couple minutes left, and I have a couple questions that I'd like to ask with the time that we have left. So first of all, the one question, if we kind of stick with this idea of moving forward and kind of what can we do from here? The first question that I'd like to ask is whether or not you can speak to a little bit more areas where you see hope, where you see progress happening in the prevention and ending of women's homelessness. Yeah, if you could just talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Oh, love that. Maybe I'll kick it to Mary or Khulud first.
I think one aspect of the project that gave a lot of hope was really the commitment of organizations and service providers and frontline workers on the ground. And, you know, I really think it's exciting to think about what is possible if these organizations could be leaders in developing deeply affordable housing for the population of folks they're already supporting. If they could, you know, build on their capacities in running sort of low barrier drop-in programs, but look at how could that maybe be extended to like low barrier supportive housing, or just really sort of in awe about you know, the commitment of folks around the country and how that commitment could be really built upon for change. Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah, I kind of echo what Mary just said. I think I find a lot of hope in the work that's happening locally, the advocacy that's happening in places all around Canada, just some really great work that different groups are doing in recognizing challenges and also coming to aid in different ways, and particularly in harm reduction spaces where they're really being present for people who are dealing with multiple issues and are being oppressed by multiple systems. So that to me gives me a lot of hope. But then I hope, and it also gives me hope that, you know, the work that we could do really does get to those people and help them in their work as well. So I hope that this work gets through to the very grassroots level and helps people understand and look at the issues that they're experiencing in their communities in different ways.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. I think, yeah, what's exciting to me at the moment, I think, is our conversation around homelessness and housing is changing. Like, it was really exciting to see housing kind of centered in debates in the recent election, the federal election. You know, I don't think it's the kind of more marginalized issue that it was thought to be 10 years ago. This is like front of mind for folks like all across the housing continuum, all across the income continuum. So there's an understanding that this is a critical issue, which is great. I also think that we are starting to get our heads around the fact that what is driving homelessness, a key element of it is the financialization of housing. So the positioning of housing as a mechanism for wealth generation rather than as a social good, the role of real estate investment trusts, of, you know, vacant buildings, of corporate buyers. I mean, there's been such incredible thinking and work that's been done on that I feel like is emerging into the public consciousness in a way it hasn't. And so what gives me hope is thinking about where that conversation is going to go and what it's going to mean in terms of us developing solutions that work for women and gender diverse folks who are kind of suffer most greatly in financialized housing markets in many ways. And so I think that kind of understanding of the role of financialization is key. And I mean, as I said, I've gone on about it at some length, but the human rights piece is really key. We're going to have this federal mechanism, the Federal Housing Advocate and Council, where we can go and say and advance systemic claims to injustice and human rights violations that the government is obliged to respond to. Where, you know, if women are women with disabilities, for example, are being systematically excluded from the housing market, from shelters, from nonprofit housing, whatever, those kinds of systemic claims, we actually have a mechanism within the human rights infrastructure in Canada now to address it. And I think the accumulation of those cases will build better policy for us nationally. And I'm excited to watch that happen.
Great. Thank you. So I'm just seeing the time. I'll just let you know that Karen had a lot of great follow-up insights around women's veteran homelessness. So Karen, I'll make sure that the panelists get that information. And Uli G had a connection that they wanted you to know about around older women's homelessness or older women's research. So I'll make sure, Uli, that they also get that information. My final question, and there's 1 minute left, is what do folks do now? They've come to this presentation, maybe they've read the report, maybe they haven't. Maybe one thing from each of the three of you, what do people do now?
Yeah. You folks want to go ahead?
I'll just quickly say that I think it would be amazing for us to connect with people. The network's a really new entity. We're looking to connect with people all across. We're looking to see where and how we can collaborate with people to take this work into different regions and take this work local. So I super encourage people to come to us with their ideas, and let's see how we can make them happen.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say as well, to come to a meeting or to join us even just via email to connect. And really, as Kaitlin said at the beginning, we want this work to be relevant. And so to feel like to let us know what would be most helpful. The data is big and there's lots of ways to think about it and share it.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that, I mean, governments are responsible for upholding the human rights of women and gender diverse folks. They are accountable to us. Our hope with this research is that it will help you hold them accountable. And so, you know, tell your MPs, tell your local councillors, city councillors, this is a gendered issue. We need to be approaching it differently. You know, we're seeing the gaps in funding. We're seeing that affordable really isn't affordable by any, you know, stretch of the imagination, and kind of hold governments to account for that. And our hope is like we create a report, then we create a range of resources that folks can use to do that advocacy. And please connect with us if you have ideas about how else we can do that, because we are in a critical moment. Housing is a human right in Canada. We can make progress on this issue right now.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Well, that's a good note to end on. I want to thank again our panelists, Kaitlin, Mary, and Khulud. You shared so much incredible insight, and thank you to all of the audience members who are with us here today. Just to remind you, we'll make sure that you get a copy of the recording, the PowerPoint slides, how you can connect with this group of researchers, and all of the links to all of the reports and relevant information. We'll make sure that that gets to you. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.